Last week we began to look at Jesus' last days discourse in Mark chapter 13, if you want to open up your Bibles to Mark 13. Now, as a reminder, when I use the term last days, what I'm talking about is time that started at Jesus' resurrection and will conclude when Jesus returns. So we are living in the last days. Now, also, what you need to understand is that these two sermons, last week's and this week's, are based upon my interpretation of Mark chapter 13, as well as Matthew chapter 24 and Luke chapter 20, and how I see those chapters and how I would interpret them. You may agree, you may disagree, that's perfectly fine. In most of the interpretations, there are some, strengths and there are some weaknesses. And so, anyway, by way of review, Jesus tells the disciples that the beautiful, magnificent temple that they were looking at from the Mount of Olives, that it was going to be completely, totally destroyed. So much so destroyed that not one stone would be left on another. Now, naturally, the disciples would hear this and they would wonder about it. And so they did what most people would do. If somebody says something is going to happen and you want to know more about it, you ask the person who said it was going to happen. So Peter, Andrew, James, and John all ask him about what and when this would happen. Jesus replies with some events that are what Jesus calls the beginnings of the birth pains. Some see what he says in, for example, verses 5 through 8 as signs that he was about to return, signs of his coming back, his second coming. But it's very important that we understand what Jesus says at the very start of what he's talking about. He says, "See that no one leads you astray." And then he talks about all these various signs and so forth that, they aren't really signs. They're simply events. Events that are going to happen throughout the course of the last days. But they are not signs of Jesus' return. In fact, they are not signs of anything at all. Jesus warns them that some would misread these events and mislead people to a false conclusion. And so he wants his disciples to be aware and be able to teach those others that become his disciples, his followers, that these aren't anything really at all, that there is going to be, though, one sign, a real sign. The abomination that causes desolation, or the abomination of desolation, standing where he ought not to be. Luke chapter 20, verse 21 defines what Jesus is referencing here. It's mentioned in the book of Daniel as well, but Luke defines it for us. He says, "When you see armies surrounding Jerusalem, then the time to act has come." And Jesus then goes on to tell them some of the things that they should do and some things that they should not do. What should they do? They should run. They should run and not look back and hope and pray that travel conditions are favorable. Now, here's the thing. If Jesus were talking about his return in these verses, what good is running going to do? If he was talking about his return in these verses, what would it matter if it was winter or the Sabbath, or if a woman was pregnant or nursing, or if they had small children or anything? It wouldn't. So it's very clear that what he's talking about is something different, something that they need to escape from. And then he tells them what not to do. They are not to listen to those who give false hope. And they are not to let their guard down. Now, up to this point, all scholars that I would consider to be reputable, respected, agree that Jesus is actually talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. That's what Jesus had predicted. That's what the disciples had asked about. It just makes sense that that's what they are talking about. Now, while some say that these are events, these birth pains are things that will take place up until the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, others say that they last throughout the last days. We see that they've happened. They're happening even today. So we know that we are living in the last days. Well, this brings us to verse 24. Now, some people would say that in interpreting Mark 13, that at verse 24, Jesus stops talking about Jerusalem and begins to talk about his return. And he talks about his return until verse 27. And in verse 28, Jesus resumes talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and does so until verse 31. And then in verse 32, he goes back to talking about his return in 32 through 37. Sort of what in logic or reasoning is called an A-B pattern. And you might say, well, that sounds really confusing. And it does. And if I had to pick a second place, a second option for how I would interpret Mark 13, that would be it. Despite the fact that it sounds so confusing and everything, but fortunately, I don't have to worry about my second opinion or my second choice, because I think the first choice has less problems. I believe that Jesus is continuing to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem all the way through verse 31. And then in verses 32 through 37, he talks about his return. And I'll show you why in just a few moments. But let's back up to verse 24. Remember, Jesus has just told them that this tribulation is going to be the worst that has ever would happen to the earth, verse 19. And that if the Lord had not cut short those days, no human being would be saved or survive, depending on the version that you have, verse 20. So it is possible to escape the tribulation, and it is possible to survive the tribulation. Again, both of those let us know that, Jesus is not talking about his return. He's talking about something different. Plus, there are some events to happen after that tribulation. Again, if we're talking about the return of Jesus, there's nothing going to happen on earth after the return of Jesus. The earth will be destroyed by fire, 1 Peter tells us. So anyway, let's take a look at Mark chapter 13, verses 24 through 27. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Now then, what I want us to do is divide these four verses into two groups. The first is verses 24 and 25. And verses 24 and 25 contain some cosmic imagery. Cosmic imagery that seems to indicate the end of the world. But in reality, if you look at it, you find out that there are numerous Old Testament references and texts that use very similar cosmic imagery that are not talking about the end of the world. Let me give you a couple of examples. Isaiah chapter 13, verse 10. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. In Isaiah chapter 34, verse 4, all the hosts of heaven shall rot away, and the skies roll up like a scroll, and their hosts shall fall, as leaves fall from the vine, like leaves falling from the fig tree. When Isaiah writes these two passages, he is not talking about Jesus' second coming. He is not talking about the end of the world. What he's talking about is the the overthrow of nations within human history. That's what he's referencing here, and he uses the same sort of cosmic imagery that Jesus uses in Mark 13 and in Matthew 24 and in Luke 20 in his description of the destruction of Jerusalem. But what about verses 26 and 27? I mean, those verses, they have to be talking about the return of Jesus. They have to be talking about his second coming, because he says about them coming on the clouds and so forth. Well, the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds, simple explanation, maybe referencing a heavenly coming to God for vindication that Jesus is going to do, similar to what happens in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 through 27. A similar type of coming is described. It's very possible that it may be a coming in judgment with power and glory. You know, Jesus' prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem was one of his most specific and most observable prophecies that he made. And when he made that prophecy, people would know if it came to pass or not. He may be said to come to do it, the destruction, even though it's actually the army of an opposing nation that does the work. And I say, now wait a second, has that ever happened? Well, yeah, you read through the book of Judges. God would judge his people. They would be guilty of sin, and he would come to judge them, but it would be an opposing nation that would come and do the work and that would carry out the destruction. So the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds, it could be a heavenly coming. It could just be a figurative coming in judgment. Coming nonetheless, a real coming, but just coming in judgment, even though it was the Romans that were doing the work for him. But what about the sending of the angels to gather the elect from the four corners of the world, from the corners of heaven and so forth? That has to be the end of time. That has to be the end of the world. That has to be Jesus' return. Actually, it doesn't. Here's why. What he could be talking about here is sending missionaries into the world to gather the elect into the church. I said, whoa, where does it to say missionaries or whatever? Well, in Greek, the word that we transliterated angels, that means we didn't translate it, we just brought it from the Greek letters into the English letters. The Greek word angels, though, if you translated it, it would be messenger. Since angels are the heavenly messengers of God, it often refers to them. But it doesn't always refer to the supernatural beings we call angels. It could just be a messenger. So maybe he is sending his messengers, missionaries, out into the world to gather the elect into his church. Now, some would see the description of Jesus' coming in the clouds and the role of angels as too similar to New Testament references to the second coming, such as 2 Thessalonians 1:7, Revelation 1:7, among other passages as well. They say, well, but it's too similar. People would think about those passages by the way that Mark used the words here and so forth, and that Jesus says here. Well, thing is, we have to keep in mind that when Mark was written and read in the first century, there was no New Testament as we have it today. But there was what we call the Old Testament. The people who heard these things from the apostles and read these things after they were written in the Gospels, they would be familiar with the Old Testament writings. They would be familiar with the imagery that Isaiah used to describe the falling of a nation. And when they hear these words from Jesus, as Mark records them, as Matthew records them, as Luke records them, in all likelihood, they would have thought back to Isaiah. They would have remembered the imagery used in Isaiah, and it would have called to mind those Old Testament usages. So events that happen after that return, some cosmic that tribulation, cosmic imagery, and simple explanation for the coming of the Son of Man and the sending of angels. Then Jesus moves from there in verses 28 through 31 to talk about the importance of observation. It says, "From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that He is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." The fig tree provides signs. When its branches become tender, then you know that the seasons are about to change. Now, do you recall yesterday when Jesus was going into Jerusalem? Yesterday, by the way, is Monday. This discussion we're talking about now happens on Tuesday. On Monday, when Jesus goes into Jerusalem, he's a little bit hungry. And he sees a fig tree in the distance. And so he goes up to that fig tree to see if he could find anything on it to eat. And all he found was leaves. And Jesus cursed the fig tree. Then Mark tells us that today, Tuesday, when they're going back to Jerusalem, they walk by the same fig tree and it's withered to its roots. You see, the fig tree and leaf is a sign. It's a sign that summer is near. If you pay attention, nature provides signs of the changing of seasons. Pollen is a sign of the change of the seasons, isn't it? Yeah. And we're all feeling it right now. We know that spring is in the air. If you pay attention, nature has those signs. And Jesus has given them a sign. They are to watch for that sign. They are to be observant of that sign. When they see armies surrounding Jerusalem, when they see armies surrounding Jerusalem, then they know that the time to act has come. They would know that the destruction was near, and they could take the appropriate action. And oddly, many Christians that lived in Jerusalem at that time, they were paying attention. They were observant. They saw the armies coming. They knew that the destruction Jesus had prophesied was about to take place, and they left. And they survived. Then we come to verse 30 and a very intriguing word or phrase, this generation. Verse 30 is a very key verse to understanding Mark 13. It says, truly, Jesus says, truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. This generation. Most times when you hear the word generation, we think about a period of about 40 or so years. Within 40 years of Jesus' statements here, all of the general description or characteristics of the last days, those persecutions and so forth, they had started. Read the book of Acts. That'll tell you about those persecutions and so forth. The Roman army had come and had destroyed Jerusalem. But Jesus hadn't hadn't come on the clouds or sent his angels to gather his elect. Unless, of course, it's like we said earlier, that he's coming in judgment using the Roman army as his means of carrying out that judgment. And the angels that he sent out into all the world are his missionaries, his messengers. Now, another idea that has been brought up for interpreting this is that Jesus actually made a conditional prophecy that he would return within this generation. within the 40 or so years after he says this, but it was a conditional prophecy. We're not told what those conditions were, but the conditions obviously weren't met, and so Jesus did not return within the time that he thought he was going to return. Well, that is an especially problematic interpretation, especially given verse 31. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. You know, when Jesus says something is going to happen, he's aware of it. He doesn't, this is not a conditional thing where he doesn't tell us the conditions. If it was conditional, he would have given us the conditions. Again, we mentioned it earlier in the series about Jonah in Nineveh. His prophecy was, you're 40 days and y'all are toast. Y'all are history. Unless you repent. What happened? The people of Nineveh repented. And so the conditional prophecy of Jonah didn't happen because they repented and they turned to God and everything was good with them, except for with Jonah who was very upset. But anyway, that's Jonah. We're talking about Jesus. We're talking about Mark 13. So the importance of observation. You can see a sign coming. You see the armies surrounding Jerusalem. When you see that, you can act. But concerning that day, verse 32. But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey, when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. First thing we want to talk about is the Greek words but. Now some of you are looking at that and you're looking on your outline and you're thinking, he must have, that S on the end of word must be a typo. Actually, it's not a typo. It's there on purpose because the Greek language has two words that translate into the one English word, but. Okay, there is the word that as it is, one use as it appears in verses 9, verse 14, and verse 24, among other places in this passage, but those are just the ones at the beginning of a paragraph, maybe in the Bible, in your version. The word here is used to describe a minor contrast or comparison. Kind of like if you look at the first use of that, the verses 5 through 8, he's talking about the deception and not to be misled by it and everything. But then in verse 9, he starts off with, but be on your guard. Okay, people are going to be deceived by these quote-unquote signs that really aren't signs of anything at all, but you be on your guard. So there is an important distinction made between the ones that are being fooled and the ones that are on their guard. But it's somewhat minor in contrast or comparison. Another use appears in verse 32. The word as it's used, that appears in verse 32 is a word used to denote a sharp contrast or comparison. The sharp person is going to be able to observe when the armies begin to surround Jerusalem, and the one who is sharp, who is intelligent, is going to be able to get out of Jerusalem as quickly as they can. So there will be a sign about that destruction. But concerning that day and that hour, by the way, notice how up until this point in Mark 13, he's been talking about those days, plural. And here he starts talking about that day, that hour, singular. So, that's another clue that he's talking about something different. But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows. There will not be signs. There will not be indications. It will just happen. Now notice, it's interesting that the angels don't know, and that not even the Son, not even Jesus, knows when that day will be. But God does. God has picked it out. God knows when Jesus will return. He does. So, if only the Father knows, when a preacher, or perhaps even a politician, tells you that they know when the world is going to end, they are claiming to have knowledge that not even Jesus has, that only God has, that only God knows. So you should be very careful about listening to them, no matter what. God has already picked out the day. God has already set the day for Jesus to return. And for us to think that we can somehow extend beyond that date or in the world before that date is to think that the created has more power than the Creator. So we need to be very careful about that. And instead of trying to predict when the end is going to come, we need to live in a state of constant readiness for Jesus to return, so that when He does return, He finds us as faithful servants. Which brings us to the Greek word, watch. Jesus tells a parable here, the parable of the doorkeeper. The doorkeeper's main job was to stay awake and to keep watch for the master to come. Because when the master returned, the doorkeeper's job was to open up the door so that the master doesn't have to wait, doesn't have to knock. The servant opens up the door because he was paying attention. Pity the doorkeeper who falls asleep while on duty. Pity the doorkeeper who somehow allows himself to get distracted and is not keeping an eye out for the master. The parable of the doorkeeper has a very important application because of the job of a disciple. The job of a disciple is, yes, to make more disciples, but the job of a disciple is also to stay awake and to keep watch so that Jesus doesn't return and catch us sleeping spiritually. Jesus closes this discourse with a similar warning to how He began the discourse. Watch. Keep watch. Stay awake. He begins with a warning to keep watch or to stay awake so that you are not led astray. And then He concludes it with a warning to keep watch, to stay awake so that you are ready for His return. Which is kind of sort of just what I told you last week, isn't it? That Mark 13 really has 2 points. First point, a warning not to be misled by false claims that Jesus had already returned or that certain quote-unquote signs indicate the immediate proximity of His return. And a warning to be faithful and to live in a state of constant preparation for His return. So I guess all that's left is for me to ask, are you? Are you living your life in a state of constant readiness for Jesus to return? Are you prepared for that great day that is coming to be today? Are you prepared for that great day to be right now? Because you see, there is a great day coming. It's going to be a bright day also. But if we're found asleep, if we're found not keeping watch, if we're found unaware, if we're found not prepared, then that great day, that bright day, is going to be a sad day. If you're not prepared for that great day to come today, get prepared. Maybe that preparation involves you making a private response where you're seated at, where you're at right now, just a private response, praying, asking God to help you to do a better job of living in that constant state of preparedness, that constant readiness. Perhaps, though, maybe it involves something a little bit more. Maybe it involves a public response, asking for the prayers of this body to pray with you and to pray for you. Or maybe you need to get that initial preparation taken care of by being immersed in the watery grave of baptism, having your sins washed away. Whatever your response is, I urge you, make it so that you are prepared. And if we can help you through a public response, won't you come to the front now as we stand and sing together?